Hi, good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about the first non-stop flight that occurred over the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris. The motivation for such a flight was a prize that was announced by a hotel tycoon called Raymond Ortig. I want to take you back to the early part of the 20th century. It was in 1903 that the first aeroplane was invented, and the prize here was also announced somewhere in 1920s, because the first flight that had successfully moved from New York to Paris was in 1927. After the prize was announced, there were four attempts to cross the Atlantic from New York to Paris, but all four attempts failed. All four attempts led to the crash of the planes, and the pilots were also killed. There was a young American pilot called Charles Lindbergh, who had also wanted to throw his hat in the ring, who had also wanted to try his luck. For this, he made himself a plane in 1926, or rather, he ordered a special plane. The name of the plane was Saint Saint Spirit of Saint Louis. It was a small plane. It only had a length of 8.5 meters, the size of a tour bus, and unlike the planes of his competitors, it only had a one engine, whereas his competitors had three engines. His competitors had at least two crew members, but he did not accommodate any crew members. And it was because of the design of the plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. It was more about accommodating a number of fuel tanks to carry out that long distance journey across the Atlantic. There were fuel tanks that were attached on the plane, on the wing, and the largest of the fuel tank was attached in front of the cockpit of the pilot. This made it difficult for the pilot to look at what was in front of him. It blocked his view. To actually have a good view of what was in front of him, he carried an instrument that was made of lenses and mirrors called a periscope. And often, the young pilot, Charles Lindbergh, also had to peep out to the window to get a visibility of what is in front of him. And since there were these fuel tanks, and since four pilots before him had also tried to cross the Atlantic from New York to Paris and were unsuccessful, the adventure that he was going to partake in was a dangerous one. If the plane had crashed somewhere, the fuel tanks would explode, and it would also lead to an instant death of the pilot. So the journey at that time was dangerous. It was a small plane, and there was limited amount of fuel. But Charles Lindbergh decided to go ahead with his decision to cross the Atlantic, because there were other competitors who were waiting in the wing to take the prize, the Raymond Orteg prize. The prize amount was $25,000, and Charles Lindbergh did not want to miss out on the opportunity to win that prize. And therefore, on May 20, 1927, his plane was ready. It was on the wet and the grassy runway, The mechanic of the plane had rotated the propeller to start the engine, and the young pilot in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, was on the move. Few moments later, he would pull back the joystick of the plane, and the plane was airborne. Let me fast forward a little bit to 13 hours after the departure from New York. He had departed early in the morning on a Friday, May 20, 1927. After 13 hours, he was inside a rain-bearing cloud, which was of a vertical extent, and it was a very dangerous cloud. It is called cumulonimbus cloud. It had ice particles in it, and these ice particles were getting stuck on the plane. And the pilot Charles Lindbergh had observed that there was ice accumulating on the plane, and he decided that it was not going to be wise to travel inside a cloud from then on, because it would be a hindrance to the pace of the plane, and he had limited fuel. The fuel, there will be a fuel consumption due to the reduction in the pace of the plane, as there was accumulation of ice on its body. Moreover, if in case he loses a lot of fuel and is going to run out of fuel and probably crash into the ocean under him, the Atlantic Ocean, then he did not even have a parachute with him, because he thought that it would add to the weight of the plane, and he wanted to keep it as light as possible. So therefore, he wanted to turn out of the cloud. He turned out of the cloud and took a longer route. Even taking a longer route will consume a lot of fuel, but he thought this was a better option. Every now and again, after turning out of the cloud, he would look at his plane, he would look at the wings and all, and he would ensure that the ice would be removed on its own, just to confirm that. And there was a time when the ice was completely gone, and he was safely moving across the Atlantic. As he was moving across the Atlantic, he was also moving across different time zones, and therefore he had to deal with the jet lag. He had to deal with this drowsiness, the exhaustion he was feeling because of the movement across the different time zones and the jet lag. There were times and there were moments where he would doze off for a few seconds or even minutes, and the plane would be wavering dangerously in its course. So these were the two problems that he had so far faced. One is getting through the icy cumulonimbus cloud, in which case he had decided to come out of it. And the second, he had to also fight off the jet lag. The jet lag he was wary of. He knew that it would be dangerous if he had gone to sleep while the flight was on the move, so he would get up. He would keep getting up after every few seconds and minutes. Let me take a leap forward in time. 27 hours have passed after he had departed from New York. Beneath him, there was ocean, but he had found some changes. The changes were, he had found a kind of a whale that is called porpoise, and he has also found a bird that was circling, a seagull. And what was much to his delight was he could also find fishing boats. It meant that land was nearby. It meant that he had crossed the Atlantic. He had reached the other end of the Atlantic. He was quite happy. But the problem was, he didn't know over which part of the land he was flying. He doubted that it could be Ireland, but he had to confirm. So therefore he decided to descend his plane to near the ocean, where he could possibly ask the fishermen of the boat to head towards Ireland, and he had done as he had planned. He had reached near to the waves of the ocean, and there he shouted and asked the fisherman if Ireland was, in which direction was Ireland. But the fishermen just stared at him. They could not hear him, and hence he could not get any response from them. And therefore he thought that there was no use hanging over the ocean. It could also increase the possibility of a crash, and hence he started to climb up once again. After a few minutes, rather than being over the ocean, he was over land. But he still was not sure where he was. He would take out some of his navigational charts and a map where he would mark the coastline that he had observed. And from this he got to know that he was in southwestern Ireland. He flew over that part of Ireland for some time. He observed the green fields of Ireland, but he was still oblivious in which direction he had to go. He circled in the sky for a while, and at one point he was traveling in a certain direction, and beneath him once again there was ocean and clouds that were merging into the horizon. He actually tried to keep his nerve. He was losing his calm. But at one point he turned around and looked over his shoulders, and he got a clarity that he was leaving Ireland behind. He also took out his map to get some clarity. He got to know that he was moving towards America and leaving Ireland behind. With this clarity in mind, he turned back once again and he flew over Ireland and then over England, where at a certain region in the coast of England called Plymouth, there was a report that Spirit of St. Louis, the flight of Charles Lindbergh, was going to start crossing the English Channel. The English Channel is an arm of the Atlantic Ocean in between South England and North France. And this news from England had also spread to Paris, and it was a time when people would be enthusiastic about such daring feats of flight. It was a time when people would pay for witnessing daring feats of flight. Let me come back to Spirit of St. Louis. He flew over France, and at midnight of the French time, he would be reaching Paris. And once he landed, there were a huge crowd of people that were waiting to welcome him. Around 25,000 of them. They were so enthusiastic that they had overpowered a steel fences and also a police barrier. The flight had taken him 33 and a half hours. Nowadays, with a modern flight, one could cross the Atlantic from New York to Paris in 8 hours. But then it was just the beginning of aviation. And the people have breached the steel fences and the police barriers, and a few hands carried him from the ground and above the crowd. He had become famous. He had won the Raymond Ortec Prize, and he had successfully crossed the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris. It was a great, great feat at that time. He had to deal with many troubles. Firstly, he had to deal with the ice that was accumulating on the plane in the cumulonimbus cloud, and then he had to fight off. And after he had observed the ice, he had to keep his nerves. He could not panic. And then he had to keep off the jet lag. He had to deal with the jet lag. Every time he dozed off a few seconds, the plane would be wavering on its path dangerously. And then once he found that he was in proximity to the land, he did not know where he was. And for this, he wanted to consult the fisherman, but the fisherman would not hear what he was saying. He would come back, he would climb back to the skies, oblivious of where he was. He would take out his maps. There was no radar. Even though there was a facility for a radar system, he didn't seem to believe it. And of course, there was no GPS. And finally, he was able to keep his nerve, keep calm, and find out in which direction he was moving, and ultimately landed in France and won the much sought after prize by a group of pilots of America, the Raymond Dotic Prize, a prize of $25,000. Hope you found this adventure of the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris across the Atlantic interesting. Thank you.